Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be analyzing the whole front line, starting with the Kherson counteroffensive. So looking at it again, I'm still standing by my initial prediction where the Ukrainians will be trying to push through the first line of defense to then hit the second line of defense from behind, trying to encircle the Russian forces around Alexandrivka, and then pushing down the center to get control of the highway and push towards Kherson from the center west, and pushing eastwards to hit it from the east as well. However, I saw a update by Ryber 2 to 3 days ago where they said that the most likely course of action by the Ukrainians would be a frontal assault just through the highways directly, through Alexandrivka and through Siversk, which I disagree with, because I see the point where you could encircle all of this by attacking from the south and from the center, from the north and from the center at the same time. However, the issue here is that the Russians could just fall back. The Ukrainians would need to push straight through to connect with the offensive in the east to ensure that they are able to encircle this whole pocket to the north. Otherwise, the Russians would just fall back and shell them to try to pin them down. So that's what I think for the western part of Kherson. As for the eastern part, we can see that the Ukrainians have been pushed back a bit to this smaller salient. However, they have control of the two villages to the either side. They have control of the two villages to either side, which allows them to initiate another offensive to this village here by the road, which will allow them to push southwards. And here again, Ryber disagrees with me, saying that they expect the Ukrainians to just pass down the roads, which would make sense in case the offensives happen during the rainy season, as the fields will be much more difficult to traverse through. However, what I believe is that they will still try to do this cut through in the middle, as this will allow them to gain control of this whole river line. And rather than actually connecting these lines, just allowing the Russians, or just forcing the Russians to fall back, will allow the Ukrainians to take control of it. So just a threat which can occur by them controlling this area here, the villages on the front line, as well as the village here by the road, will allow them to force Russians to fall back. Otherwise they would get encircled, and we would see them moving through these fields, and possibly when the weather is rainy, which will allow them to get stuck in the mud, which will allow the Ukrainians to launch artillery and attack them as they are retreating. So I still stand by what I think the Ukrainians will do, especially because if the Russians decide to fall back to this road and flank the Ukrainians advancing in the south, they'll be able to cut off the Ukrainians rather than the Ukrainians cutting off any of the Russians. So generally I would believe that the Ukrainians would try to go with the more safer approach, where they attack and try to push the Russians back, because they know that it's very difficult for the Russians to retreat across the river, either rivers, as the western one has no bridges and the southern one, Kherson, has been damaged, which means that as long as they push the Russians back to the coastline, they're able to just continue pushing them. If they're forcing the Russians to get on the run, then the Russians will not be able to shoot back, as the artillery can't shoot while moving, which means that the Ukrainian goal is to keep pushing the Russians until the Russians are forced to reach the coast, after which they are forced to either surrender or fight to their death. So I think that's their goal, to encircle the Russians in the smallest pocket possible, all in one go, rather than a step-by-step encirclement where they cut off half and then do the other half. I think the Ukrainians are dreaming big, and they're trying to achieve the best possible outcome in this counteroffensive. Moving on to the Zaporizhia area, where there are still reports of troop buildups here in the center, which means that the Ukrainians are still most likely planning this offensive, especially with their attacks on Nisiryanka, which means that generally their plan is still to reach towards Tokmak and capture that before moving onwards to Melitopol and Vesele, as these are important areas within the Zaporizhia Oblast, connecting most of the villages and the cities in the areas through the highways and roads, as we are soon entering into October, which is in 11 days, which means that generally we'll see a lot more fighting for the roads rather than anything else. But we'll also see the Russians most likely either have mined or will mine the roads to prevent a fast advance, and still have some outpost here and there to kind of conduct a guerrilla warfare operation, similarly to what the Ukrainians did around Kiev when the Russians were advancing in the first time. However, this is a more difficult area to do so, as there are no forests. There's only a few valleys here and there, but mostly it is just flat lands, which makes it difficult for soldiers to hide and conduct safe operations in which they try to sabotage supply lines and so on. So generally, it will be difficult for the Russians to build up a defensive line here. However, most likely what they have is something along this valley here and the hilly area. So they have some kind of defensive position here, which will try to protect Tokmak. And from the east, they can just push onwards from this highway to cut off the Ukrainian advance if they advance too far without proper control over the area. So I think they will try to wait for the Ukrainians to make a mistake, but if the Ukrainians don't make a mistake, they'll be forcing them to fight or run away, which we have seen in Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians barely made any mistakes. Moving onwards to the Donbass area, we see that in the Donetsk front, there is a lot of fighting going on from both sides. There's a build troop up around Vuhledar from both sides. Marinka is being pushed back by the Ukrainians now, while at the same time, just a few kilometers north, Krasnohorivka is being pushed by the Russians. So there's a lot of back and forth going on here on this front line, where the artillery advantage is to the Russians, which means generally the Ukrainians would be suffering more casualties than the Russians in this area. However, with the Russians storming the villages of Krasnohorivka and others in the area, that generally means that the Russians are suffering a lot of casualties as well. Moving further north to the Bakhmut area, we see that there's actually a reported fighting here around Kurdyumivka. I haven't mapped it out yet. However, according to Rybart, there is a report that the fighting has reached Kurdyumivka, which means that Mykolaiv Drew is completely under Russian control, but also it supports my prediction from over a month ago, where I said that the Russians will attempt to push from the western side of this valley that goes through Bakhmut to get a foothold on this side of the valley, which will allow them to push onwards and intercept any of the Ukrainian artillery stationed here and the defensive positions that the Ukrainians have built, because the valley here doesn't allow the Russians to just push through head on, which will force them to go from either side to cut the supply lines, as well as to fight and engage the Ukrainian positions on even ground rather than giving them the high ground. So generally what we will see is that the Russians will try to outflank the Ukrainians by getting a foothold around Soledar, which they have achieved, and then push through Krasnohora and the northern area and connect it with the southern push through the western side of the valley. So they will try to encircle Bakhmut rather than storm it directly. What we're seeing here is most likely that they are trying to get control over the eastern part of the valley of the Bakhmut area. There's also a river cutting it in two, so around the river line we will see the Russians try to establish control, and then they will engage in an encirclement maneuver. As for the Siversk area, we see that the Ukrainians are pushing, but generally the Russians aren't having any activity here in the area, which means that most likely the goal is to either the goal is most likely either to cut off the Siversk pocket, or that they're very pressured by the Ukrainian counteroffensive around the Liman area, which means that they are low on manpower and aren't able to fill out all the operational areas. Or if they successfully manage to counterattack the Liman, if they successfully manage to defend the Liman counterattack, that means that they have the ability to potentially conduct another counterattack by pushing all their forces around Bakhmut and cutting the road, which would force the Ukrainians to either fall back now that the rainy season is approaching, or to get encircled by the Russians. So we're seeing a big gamble by both sides here in the Siversk pocket, as it is very difficult to retreat through this once the rain kicks in and the ground becomes muddy, as there's only one other road from Siversk to the west. As we can see down here in the center, there's this village here, Resnikivka, which a road goes through, and it's a small road, which will mean high traffic would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to organize. So generally speaking, if the Russians manage to reach this point before the Ukrainians fall back, that would mean that they would only have one road of retreat. And if the Russians push to Alexandrivka, that means that the Ukrainians are completely cut off. So they would need a push through this whole area to cut off Ukrainian soldiers. Moving further on to the Kharkiv area, we see that the Russians are trying to prevent Ukrainian troop buildup, as a Ukrainian offensive here in the area would threaten the Luhansk northern flank and would allow them to essentially go around all of the defenses that the Russians have built up around the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Lyman area, meaning that they could just force the Russians to retreat essentially out of the country, or at the very least to a defensive line similarly to the original line of no contact that we saw prior to the war on the 24th of February. So generally what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are successfully conducting counteroffensives in a lot of areas. However, there's still a very real threat of Russian forces making a successful offensive in the Donbass region or in the Kherson counteroffensive, conducting a counteroffensive, or in the Kharkiv front as well. So what we'll see is essentially it will be a very tough test for the Russian defenders and a very tough test for the Ukrainian offensive capabilities, and whether or not Russia decides on conducting a larger offensive with more troops by mobilizing the armed forces that they have already within the Russian Federation to conduct a large counteroffensive. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching and have a great day.